615 hours, August 12, 1943. RAF Molesworth, England. Lieutenant James Holloway pulled himself through the narrow fuselage of the B-17 flying fortress named Reluctant Lady, his boots finding familiar purchase on the aluminum catwalk, 22 years old. 11 combat missions behind him, and every nerve ending still screamed that this would be the day his luck ran out. The nose turret position waited for him at the front of the aircraft, 40 pounds of plexiglass and steel that made him the most exposed man in the formation. While tail gunners faced the terror of watching fighters approach, the nose gunner saw everything coming head-on. He watched the flak blossom black against the sky. He saw the fighters materialize from clouds like wolves emerging from fog. He felt the impact of every near miss through his bones. 20 seconds to start engines, the intercom crackled. Holloway settled onto the cramped seat, his knees pressing against the curved plexiglass. 2.50 caliber Browning anti-machine guns flanked his position, their ammunition belts feeding from boxes bolted to the bulkhead behind him. In front of his face, a primitive gun sight, just a ring and a post waited for targets that would appear at combined closure speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. The statistics haunted every pre-dawn mission. 8th Air Force intelligence briefings painted a grim picture. The average B-17 crew survived 11 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. Nose gunners and ball turret operators died Festerstall. They absorbed the first impacts of head-on attacks, the preferred tactic of Luftwaffe pilots who had learned that American bombers were most vulnerable from the front. German fighter doctrine had evolved through 2 years of combat. The head-on pass gave pilots the smallest defensive target and the longest firing window. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 approaching at 400 miles per hour from 12 o'clock high had roughly 3 seconds to aim, fire, and break away before colliding with the bomber formation. Those 3 seconds determined life or death for everyone aboard. Holloway had watched it happen on his 3rd mission. The B-17 flying lead position in the high squadron took a direct hit from a Focke-Wulfs 190's 20mm cannons. The rounds punched through the plexiglass nose, traversed the entire aircraft, and exited through the tail. The nose gunner never fired a shot. The bomber fell out of formation trailing smoke and flame, only to parachutes emerge before the aircraft exploded. Training manuals taught patience. Wait for the fighter to close, aim carefully, fire in short bursts, conserve ammunition. The instructors at gunnery school had drilled these principles into every student. A disciplined gunner could make 600 rounds last an entire mission. The doctrine assumed the enemy would cooperate. The Luftwaffe did not. German pilots opened fire at 800 yards, pouring cannon shells into bomber formations while American gunners held their triggers, waiting for the mythical 300-yard optimum range. By the time nose gunners began shooting, the damage was already done. Fighters flashed past at closing speeds that made accurate tracking nearly impossible. Hits were a matter of luck as much as skill. Holloway had questioned everything about the doctrine since his first mission. The mathematics were simple. A Focke-Wulfs 190 at 700 yards presented a target roughly the size of his thumbnail held at arm's length. At 400 yards, that same fighter filled half his gun sight. But at 400 yards, the German had already fired, already committed to his attack run, already decided whether the bomber would survive. Waiting meant accepting death as the default outcome. Holloway refused to accept that calculation. His first test came on Mission 5, a raid against submarine pens at Lorient. 3 Bf-109s approached from 12 o'clock low, climbing through scattered clouds. Standard doctrine said wait until the formation leader opened fire. Holloway squeezed both triggers at 800 yards, sending a stream of tracers arcing toward the lead fighter. The German pilot saw the fire coming and broke off his attack, rolling inverted and diving away before reaching effective cannon range. His wingman followed. The formation reached the target without losing a single aircraft. The squadron gunnery officer, Quest Holloway, after landing, the ammunition count showed he had expended nearly 300 rounds on a single engagement. At that rate, he would run dry before reaching targets deep inside Germany. Holloway explained his reasoning. A dead gunner conserved ammunition perfectly, but contributed nothing to the mission success. The officer remained skeptical. Other gunners heard about the incident. Some called it reckless. Holloway was gambling with the crew's survival. But reluctant lady kept coming home mission after mission, while other aircraft in the 303rd Bombardment Group did not. By early August, the 303rd had lost 12 aircraft in just 3 months of operations, 120 men. Gone captured, wounded, or buried in temporary graves across occupied Europe. The survivors gathered at briefings and studied the phases of empty bunks. Everyone understood the mathematics. Someone would die today. The only question was who. Now, at 0630 on August 12, 1943. Holloway watched the English countryside slide beneath reluctant ladies' wings as the bomber climbed through overcast sky. Somewhere ahead, across the English Channel and deep into Germany, waited the target, Schweinfurt, heart of the German ball-bearing industry, defended by over 300 fighters and the most concentrated flak batteries in the Reich. 186 B-17s lifted off from bases across eastern England that morning. 127 P-47 Thunderbolts would escort them partway. But fuel limitations meant the fighters would turn back over Belgium. The bombers would fly the final 200 miles to Schweinfurt alone. Holloway checked his ammunition belts for 100 rounds per gun, 800 total. Plus an extra belt he had scrounged from supply and loaded against regulations, the manual said. 800 rounds was sufficient. Holloway had already decided the manual was wrong about everything else. The extra ammunition added 30 pounds to his position, weight that would cost fuel and reduce the bomber's altitude ceiling. The trade seemed acceptable by noon. He would discover whether his calculations were correct. The cost of being wrong was a closed casket funeral and a telegram to his family in Ohio. 915 hours, August 12, 1943. Over occupied France, the English Channel fell away behind the formation, its grey waters giving way to the green patchwork of French farmland. Holloway watched through his plexiglas bubble as the coast slipped past the last friendly territory he would see for 6 hours. Ahead lay France, then Belgium, then the heart of Nazi Germany. The P-47 escorts held position on the bomber stream, their blunt-nosed silhouettes a comforting presence against the morning sky. Thunderbolt pilots flew with advantage in every engagement above 15,000 feet, their turbocharged engines and heavy armor making them a match for anything the Luftwaffe could send. But comfort was temporary. The arithmetic of fuel consumption governed everything. Each Thunderbolt carried enough aviation gasoline for roughly 90 minutes of combat flying. The mission to Schweinfurt would take 6 hours. For most of the journey, the bombers would fly alone. At 0945, the escorts waggled their wings the prearranged signal and turned back toward England. Holloway watched them shrink to specks against the northern horizon. The silence on the intercom lasted 30 seconds before someone cracked a joke that no one laughed at. Now it began. The first German fighters appeared at 10:12, climbing from airfields round Paris in groups of 6 and 8. Holloway counted 12, then 20. Then stopped counting as the sky ahead filled with black crosses on yellow noses, the Luftwaffe. had massed over 300 interceptors along the route, positioning squadrons at every point where the bomber stream might cross. The lead fighters began their attacks at 10:18. Diving from 12 o'clock high with the sun at their backs, Holloway tracked the first Messerschmitt through his gun sight, watching it grow from a speck to a distinct shape, elliptical wings, yellow cowling. The blurred disk of a spinning propeller. 800 yards, 700, 600. Standard Doctrine said wait until 300. Holloway squeezed both triggers at 600, sending a stream of tracers directly into the fighter's flight path. The German pilot never flinched. He held his course, cannons blinking orange from his wing roots, and the two streams of fire crossed in the empty sky between them. Holloway's tracers walked up the fighter's nose, across the cockpit, and into the engine cowling just as the German's cannon shells tore through reluctant lady's nose. Section. The impact threw Holloway against his seat. Plexiglas fragments sprayed across the compartment. Something hot sliced through his flight jacket and buried itself in his left shoulder. He kept firing. The Messerschmitt flashed past so close he could see the pilot's face, young, shocked, mouth open in a scream that Holloway couldn't hear. Smoke poured from the German's engine. The fighter rolled on toe, its back, and dove toward the ground, trailing a ribbon of flame. First kill. Ammunition down to 600 rounds. Blood soaked through his sleeve. "Jimmy, you hit." The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. "I'm fine," Holloway lied. "Stay on course." The second wave came at 10:24. Focke-Wulf 190s this time, stubby and dangerous, approaching from slightly below to exploit the blind spot where nose guns couldn't depress enough to track them. Holloway twisted in his seat, forcing his guns downward past their mechanical limits. The modified mounts he had installed himself against regulations gave him an extra 5 degrees of depression. 5 degrees made the difference. He fired as the lead fighter pulled up into his field of view, the tracer stitching across its wing route. The Focke-Wulf broke hard right, its pilot aborting the attack rather than flying through the stream of fire. His cannons discharged harmlessly into empty air below the formation. 3 more fighters pressed the attack. Holloway tracked from target to target, firing in short bursts, conserving ammunition while maximizing disruption. The Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to American gunners holding fire until the last moment, found themselves facing tracers at ranges that should have been safe. Their attacks became ragged, poorly coordinated, less effective. At 10:37, EBF-110 twin-engine fighter approached from directly ahead, flying straight and level with the grim determination of a pilot on a suicide mission. The heavy fighter carried for 20mm cannons and machine guns in its nose, enough firepower to shred any bomber it hit. Holloway centered the massive aircraft in his sights and held both triggers down. The Brownings hammered for 5 continuous seconds, pouring over 100 rounds into the oncoming fighter. The Bf-110's nose disintegrated. Its port engine exploded. The aircraft nosed over and fell toward the earth, leaving a trail of black smoke across the sky. Second confirmed kill. Ammunition down to 400 rounds. The mission was barely 2 hours old. Reluctant lady's intercom crackled with damaged reports from other crew positions. The waist gunners had taken hits to their compartment. The Baltrit operator reported hydraulic fluid spraying across his bubble. Someone was shouting about fires in the radio room. Through it all, Holloway kept firing, kept tracking, kept placing tracers into the paths of attacking fighters. The Luftwaffe pilots learned to give reluctant lady space, targeting other bombers in the formation rather than flying through the fire coming from its nose. The formation reached Schweinfurt at 11:45 and began its bombing run. For 11 minutes, the bombers flew straight and level. Unable to maneuver while bombardiers lined up their sights on the factory complexes below, the flak rose to meet them black clouds of exploding steel that hammered the aircraft with shrapnel. Holloway felt the impacts through the airframe. Each near miss shook the bomber like a dog shaking a rat. The plexiglas round him spiderwebbed with cracks from flak fragments. A piece of steel punched through the nose and embedded itself in the bulkhead behind his head, close enough that he felt the wind of its passage. The bomb bay doors opened. The intercom counted down. "Bombs away." Reluctant Lady lurched upward as 3 tons of ordnance released from her belly. Holloway watched the bombs tumble toward the target, tiny specks against the smoke-shrouded city below. Explosions bloomed across the factory district. Fires spread through buildings that manufactured. Bearings for every tank, aircraft, and vehicle in the German military. The formation turned for home at 11:56. 300 miles of hostile airspace lay between them and the English Channel. The Luftwaffe was waiting. 12:15 hours, August 12, 1943. Over Germany, eastbound the return flight began with the formation in disarray. German fighters had savaged the low squadrons during the bomb run, sending 7 bombers tumbling from the sky in flames. The survivors regrouped as best they could, closing up the gaps where aircraft had been, flying through smoke trails that marked the graves of friends. Holloway scanned the sky through cracked plexiglas, his wounded shoulder throbbing with every heartbeat. The bleeding had slowed, but not stopped. His flight suit was soaked through, the blood cooling rapidly in the sub-zero air pouring through holes in the nose compartment. Hypothermia was a secondary concern behind the more immediate problem of staying alive. The Luftwaffe regrouped over Belgium. Fresh fighters rose from airfields across the region, replacing aircraft lost or damaged in the morning attacks. The second Gauntlet would be as dangerous as the first. At 12:35, a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s appeared at 12 o'clock high, diving in trail with the precision of pilots who had practiced this attack 100 times. Holloway tracked the lead fighter, waiting for the range to close. 600 yards. 500. 400. He fired at 400, sending a sustained burst directly into the fighter's flight path. The Focke-Wulf's nose dropped as its pilot jinked defensively, his cannon spraying wide of the formation. The fighter flashed past, close enough for Holloway to see the pilot's face older than most, experienced, wearing the scarf of a squadron leader. The second fighter pressed the attack, flying through the smoke of its leader's mist pass. Holloway's tracers caught it at 300 yards, stitching across its engine cowling and canopy. The plexiglas shattered. The pilot's head snapped back. The Focke-Wulf rolled inverted and dove straight down, its pilot dead or unconscious at the controls. Third kill. Ammunition down to 200 rounds. The intercom erupted with reports from across the formation. The 303rd Bombardment Group was taking heavy losses. 6 more bombers had fallen in the last 10 minutes. The Luftwaffe was concentrating its attacks on specific squadrons, overwhelming their defensive fire through sheer numbers. Bandits at 6 o'clock high. Someone shouted. Holloway couldn't help but tail his guns pointed forward, his position facing the wrong direction for rear attacks. All he could do was trust the tail gunner to do his job and focus on the threats ahead. The threats kept coming. At 12:52, ABF 109 approached from slightly above, its pilot using the sun to mask his attack. Holloway spotted the fighter at the last moment, its silhouette appearing against the glare like a ghost materializing from light. He fired without aiming, spraying tracers in the general direction of the threat. The German pilot never wavered. His cannons hammered Reluctant Lady's nose section, punching holes through the plexiglas and aluminum skin. Holloway felt the impacts as physical blows, fragments tearing through his compartment, shredding equipment, missing his body by inches. One of his guns jammed, its feed mechanism shattered by a direct hit. The other continued firing, its rhythm uneven as the damaged mechanism struggled to cycle. The fighter flashed past, its wingtip missing Holloway's position by less than 10 feet. He caught a glimpse of the German's insignia: yellow nose, a black cross, the markings of an experienced pilot from a veteran squadron. Ammunition: 120 rounds. One gun operational. 200 miles to the English Channel. The formation crossed into France at 13:20. The fighter attacks diminished as the Luftwaffe reached the limits of their operational range. But diminished didn't mean stopped. Pairs of fighters continued to slash through the formation, picking off damaged bombers that lagged behind the mainstream. Reluctant Lady was damaged, but not lagging. Her pilots held position in the formation, maintaining speed and altitude despite the holes in her fuselage and the rough running of her engines. Holloway continued to scan the sky, his remaining gun tracking every movement, every shadow that might become a threat. At 13:55, a lone Bf-109 approached from 12 o'clock low, its pilot apparently unaware that he was flying into the guns of an entire combat wing. Holloway watched him come, waiting for the range to close. 600 yards. 500. 400. The German pilot finally seemed to notice the formation ahead of him. He began to turn, presenting his broadside to Holloway's guns. 300 yards. Holloway fired. The remaining Browning hammered out a 20-round burst, tracers arcing across the intervening distance and striking the fighter's wing route. The Bf-109 staggered, smoke trailing from its engine, then rolled inverted and spiraled down. Holloway couldn't see whether the pilot recovered or crashed. The fighter disappeared into cloud cover, and he never learned its fate. Fourth probable. Ammunition: 80 rounds. The English Channel appeared on the horizon at 14:25. Holloway watched the blue-grey water expand across his field of view, each mile bringing them closer to safety, to England, to the bases where ground crews would patch the holes and load fresh ammunition for the next mission. The last fighter attack came at 14:38, just as the formation crossed the French coast. A single Focke-Wulf 190 dove from high altitude, its pilot willing to risk the anti-aircraft fire from coastal batteries for one final pass at the fleeing bombers. Holloway saw it coming. Everyone saw it coming. The fighter stood out against the pale sky like a shark against sand. He waited until 500 yards, then fired his remaining ammunition in one long, sustained burst. The tracers streamed toward the fighter, falling short, climbing, finally striking home as the range closed. The Focke-Wulf's nose dropped. Its cannons fired wild, stitching across the water below the formation. The fighter pulled up and away, smoke trailing from its engine, disappeared into the clouds. The guns went silent. Empty. Holloway checked his ammunition counters. Both showed 0. He had fired over 900 rounds during the mission, merely twice the standard load, and expended every bullet in defense of his aircraft and crew. The English coast appeared ahead, the white cliffs of Dover gleaming in the afternoon sun. Reluctant Lady crossed the coastline at 15:10, her damaged engines coughing, her crew exhausted but alive. RAF Molesworth came into view at 15:35. The landing gear groaned down. The flaps extended. The bomber settled onto the runway with a screech of rubber and a prayer of thanks from every man aboard. Holloway couldn't climb out of his position without assistance. The wounds in his shoulder and the shock of 6 hours of combat had left him weak, shaking, barely able to move. Ground crew pulled him through the nose hatch and lowered him to the tarmac. The flight surgeon counted 13 separate fragment wounds across his arms, shoulders, and upper back. 2 required surgery. The others would heal with time and rest. Word spread through the 303rd Bombardment Group by evening. The nose gunner on Reluctant Lady had scored 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables while wounded, operating a single gun with less than 100 rounds of ammunition. He had kept firing through attacks that should have killed him, through damage that should have silenced his guns. Through 6 hours of the most intense combat the 8th Air Force had yet experienced. Other gunners began asking questions. The standard doctrine said wait until 300 yards. Holloway had opened fire at 800. The doctrine said conserve ammunition. Holloway had burned through 900 rounds before landing. The doctrine produced dead gunners. Holloway was still alive. The 303rd's gunnery officer reviewed the combat footage from Reluctant Lady's gun camera that evening. The film showed Holloway's tracers reaching out to engage fighters at extreme range, disrupting attack runs before German pilots could establish firing solutions. The early fire forced enemy aircraft to maneuver defensively, degrading their accuracy and reducing hits on the bomber. By mid-September, 5 other nose gunners in the group had adopted variations of Holloway's technique. Their survival rates improved. The bombers they protected returned with less damage. The correlation was impossible to ignore. The 8th Air Force's Operational Analysis Section received a preliminary report on September 15th. The data suggested that aggressive early fire from nose positions reduced bomber casualties by disrupting head-on attacks before they reached effective range. The implications challenged years of established gunnery doctrine. Holloway recovered from his wounds at the station hospital. The fragment damage had missed major blood vessels and nose, but the flight surgeon grounded him for 6 weeks to ensure complete healing. He watched from the ground as Reluctant Lady flew mission after mission without him, each takeoff a knot of anxiety in his stomach, each return a relief that someone else was living through the hell he knew too well. The Luftwaffe had noticed something changing in American bomber formations. Their intelligence officers studied the problem, compiling reports from pilots who returned from missions against the 303rd Bombardment Group. American nose gunners were opening fire earlier, sometimes at ranges exceeding 700 yards. The change disrupted attack tactics that had worked reliably for months. German fighter pilots reported the shift in debriefings across occupied Europe. The head-on attack, once the safest approach against B-17 formations, was becoming increasingly dangerous. Tracers reached out before pilots could establish stable firing platforms. The psychological effect was significant. A pilot watching tracers stream toward his aircraft instinctively maneuvered. Even when the rounds were falling short, the tactical advantage Holloway had discovered was real, measurable, and spreading through the 8th Air Force like fire through dry grass. October 14, 1943. Ralph Molesworth, England's 2nd Schweinfurt. The name carried weight even before the mission began. Intelligence briefings estimated over 400 German fighters positioned along the route. Flak batteries ringed the target with more guns than any previous raid, weather forecasts predicted. Cloud cover that would disrupt formation assembly and make fighter interception more likely. 391 B-17s would fly the mission, the largest force yet assembled for a single target. The 303rd Bombardment Group would fly in the lead position of the 40th Combat Wing, responsible for navigation and bomb aiming for the formations following behind. Lead position meant absorbing the first fighter attacks. It meant flying straight and level while other groups maneuvered. It meant maximum exposure to everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. Holloway had returned to flight status on October 1st. Cleared for a combat after 6 weeks of healing. The scars on his shoulders were still pink, still tender, but the flight surgeon pronounced him fit for duty. He climbed back into Reluctant Lady's nose on October 3rd for a mission against Frankfurt. The guns felt familiar in his hands. The sky felt like home. Now, on the morning of October 14th, he sat through the pre-dawn briefing and listened to the intelligence officer describe the target. Schweinfurt, ball bearings, the industrial heart of the German war machine. Without Schweinfurt's production, German tanks wouldn't roll, German aircraft wouldn't fly, German submarines wouldn't sail. The strategic importance made it the most heavily defended target. In Europe, estimated fighter opposition, the intelligence officer said, is 300 to 400 aircraft. Flak is described as intense, accurate, and sustained. Weather en route is marginal. Weather over the target is expected to be clear. Weather on return is unknown. The room was silent. 391 bombers meant 3,910 aircrew. Simple. Mathematics suggested that before nightfall, hundreds of those men would be dead, wounded, or captured. The survivors would fly again tomorrow. Holloway checked his guns that afternoon. Both Brownings were freshly serviced. The barrels replaced after accumulating too many rounds during the Frankfurt mission. He loaded 1,200 rounds per gun, double the standard load, and ignored the regulations that prohibited it. The extra weight would cost altitude. The extra firepower might save his life. Reluctant Lady lifted off at 0615 on October 14th. Climbing through overcast into a sky filled with bombers. The assembly took 90 minutes, the formation slowly coalescing from individual aircraft into combat boxes, combat wings, the massive stream that would carry destruction deep into Germany. The English Channel passed beneath at 0830. The French coast appeared at 0900. The P-47 escorts turned back at 10:15. Their fuel gauges dictating retreat, while the bombers pressed on alone. The first German fighters appeared at 10:30. Not the probing attacks of previous missions, but massed formations 50, 60, 70 aircraft at a time diving on the bomber stream from every direction. The Luftwaffe had committed everything to stopping this raid. Holloway opened fire at 800 yards. His tracers reaching into the oncoming swarm. A Bf-109 absorbed a burst and fell away smoking. Another pressed its attack through the fire, its cannons hammering Reluctant Lady's nose, plexiglas shattered, aluminum tore. Holloway felt fragments slice his face, his arms, his chest. He kept firing. The attacks continued for 3 hours. Wave after wave of German fighters slashed through the formation, targeting stragglers, attacking from every angle, pressing home their runs with a determination that bordered on fanaticism. The sky filled with burning bombers, falling fighters, parachutes drifting through clouds of smoke. At 11:30, a Focke-Wulf 190 approached from 12 o'clock low, its pilot using cloud cover to mask his approach until the last moment. Holloway spotted him at 400 yards. Too late to establish a proper tracking solution, he fired anyway. Spraying tracers in the fighter's general direction, the Germans' cannons fired at the same moment. Their rounds tore through Reluctant Lady's nose, shredding Holloway's left gun, destroying his gun sight, and burying fragments deep in his legs. The impact threw him against the bulkhead. Blood poured from wounds in both thighs. The Focke-Wulf flashed past, its wingtip missing the bomber by feet. Holloway watched it go, then dragged himself back to his remaining gun. The intercom crackled with damaged reports. Reluctant Lady was dying. Both port engines were losing power. Hydraulic pressure was dropping. The bomb bay was on fire. The pilots fought to maintain position, but the bomber was falling behind, becoming a straggler. A target The formation reached Schweinfurt at 12:15. Reluctant Lady released its bombs with the rest of the group, then fell out of formation as the damage overwhelmed the crew's ability to compensate. 2 engines dead, fuel streaming from ruptured tanks, controls responding sluggishly if at all. The pilots made the decision over France. Reluctant Lady couldn't reach England. The best option was a controlled ditching in the English Channel, where air-sea rescue units might reach them before hypothermia set in. Holloway remained at his position as the bomber descended, watching for fighters that might pursue the crippled aircraft. None came. The Luftwaffe had other targets, healthier bombers still flying in formation, still carrying bombs, still capable of reaching England. Reluctant Lady hit the Channel at 15:42, impacting the Greywater at 120 miles per hour. The fuselage broke apart on impact. Holloway was thrown forward, his head striking the gun mount. Darkness swallowed him when he regained consciousness. He was floating in a life raft. British rescue boats were approaching. All 10 crew members had survived the ditching. The bomber that had carried them through 23 missions lay at the bottom of the English Channel.